Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Joseph Cambray, and he is the past president for the International Association of Analytical Psychology, also the past president of Pacifica Graduate Institute. Dr. Cambray is a Jungian analyst in Santa Barbara in California, and he is the author of the book Synchronicity, Nature and Psyche in an Interconnected Universe. So welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you, John. It's great to be here.
Joe, we're going to talk about synchronicity very shortly.
Okay.
But last weekend, as I understand it, there was a conference at Pacifica on psychedelics and individuation conversations from a Jungian perspective. And when we were talking earlier, we said it would be good to just get some of your flavor and insights from what happened there.
Well, it was a project that I was very interested in. Before I left Pacific as president, we had several conferences in this area, one on the research that was happening in psychedelics and another on the ineffable that certainly touched in this area. And an Australian colleague, Leslie Stein, and together with a faculty member and friend here at Pacifica, Dr. Lionel Corbett, got together and wanted to host this conference and also to launch a new book that just came out from Chiron Press on psychedelics and individuation. So this was a kind of a gathering of a number of the authors from that book, some of them present in the room, others present online, for a kind of exploration of what is the relationship or what might be going forward, the future relationship between Jungian analysis and the use of psychedelics, or what some people like Lionel Corbett would call entheogens. These things that create an experience of contact with the numinous or the divine.
And what did you take away? What were your thoughts after the conference?
Well, we had 2.5, 3 days of presentations in a very broad range, from literature surveys to research that people were doing, to kind of more practical, how people were integrating or not this kind of thing into their practice, and questions of what was the relationship between the frame for providing and facilitating psychedelic experiences, guiding them in a way, in juxtaposition with, say, someone who is involved in Jungian analysis, and how are the frames the same and different. And ultimately, at the end of the conference, at the behest of Leslie and Lionel, we had a series of breakout groups, which pretty much everybody stayed in, where we discussed these topics in terms of the thoughts of perhaps some future guidelines. And out of those discussions, the feeling came that this is so new, and it's so rich and interesting and complex that it's premature. We talked about everything from microdosing to the sequencing of different psychedelics that might help facilitate experiences, to the length of time, the management of the various kinds of affects, the set and setting, of course. And really, it felt that the consensus was that this needs further study, and there are some recommendations, hopefully, that will go forward about how those studies might be thought about, and the way people might be engaged in that kind of process. As you may know, in the U.S., a number of states are now starting to decriminalize and actually legalize the use of these for various kind of psychotherapeutic experiences.
And in Australia, psychologists can prescribe
now.
Yeah,
in some states, and it goes state by state in the U.S., but yes, that's true. And people who have certifications will be able to be involved with administration in those states where the substances are legal. And then, of course, there's a whole question between what is this? Is it a drug? Is it a plant medicine? The cosmologies at a deep level that are behind each of those kind of points of view are part of the discussion. There was a lot of discussion by several of the participants who had spent time in indigenous cultures, a number of them going to South America and working together with shamans and really developing the kind of attitude towards these substances that might be more part of an enchanted worldview, and how that contrasts with the pharmacological uses of these sorts of things. So I get more questions than answers.
As a 17-year-old, I went to
Mhm.
Bondi Beach and had some
Yeah.
LSD. And looking back, I would say two things about it. Firstly, it absolutely kicked off an individuation process, because it was
Yeah.
like being thrown into an entree into just the natural world and the cosmos to such a degree that
Yes.
it kind of throws you out of the mechanical universe, or takes you out of the village in a hurry, and you have to
Yes.
catch up and try to get some kind of language or understanding. And you
Yes.
can't
Mhm.
unsee what you've seen. Like you have an experience like that, and naturally you have to kind of try to understand it more, learn more about it, find out what it is.
Indeed, I thought that there were several different subgroups in the audience. There was a group of people that were a bit older, my age, your age perhaps, who had had some experiences, and they were integrated to varying degrees in people's lives. Some people had found them fascinating, but more recreational, and they hadn't uh, been the spur. There were other people who felt that no, this was really something that broke through a kind of worldview and created a real change in perspective, and that it led to deepening in an analytic way. And the need, and of course, the way dreams perhaps touch into fairly analogous states of mind. And then, of course, more recently, Jung's Red Book and the question of, his states of mind, whether he used substances or not, that's in debate. There's no hard evidence of that. And he, in fact, was rather cautious about that and warning. But when you look at the experiences of the Red Book, you quickly realize they're of the same order as what a lot of people have had on psychedelic experiences.
I know this, you might think this is a trick question or not a very fair question, but do you think he might say something a little different now on the basis of, I know, as you were saying, maybe we just started the research really,
Yeah.
and we still know very little, but do you think his mind, if Jung was around now, he might have a different view, or do you think he'd stick to his view that he had?
Well, based on his experiences from the Red Book, I'd say probably the caution was there, because I think he had one of those sets of experiences that brought him up against the notions of terror in terms of the encounter with the unconscious. And at first, he really was swimming in it. And as a psychiatrist, he knew that he was on the edge of sanity. And I think that caution would be there. Would he be willing to entertain that this might, in some situations, actually facilitate? I have a feeling he might be a little more open-minded, because the kind of research that's happened in the intervening years has been pointing towards things that couldn't have been known. And he certainly knew about refractory conditions. Where I start to feel more empathic or sympathetic with the use of these substances are when you start to look at intractable cases where people have just suffered for a very long period of time, and all of our tricks of the trade, whether it's psychotherapy or the use of the whole pharmacological regime has been unable to touch these.
Yeah.
And sometimes some of these people, we were talking about that. My wife actually was involved in a research project around ketamine analysis, and the research there with severely depressed and suicidal people was that just giving the drug itself was not any solution. It gave some relief, but it was temporary, and you get a recrudescence of the problems. But if you linked it together with a deep therapeutic process, in those open states, there was often a chance for some real transformation to occur, and that gave it a much more robust quality. So I think that's a direction that I feel more encouraged about, and I can imagine Jung would have been able to appreciate something like that.
Well, Joe, can we move on to synchronicity?
Sure, of course.
This morning when I woke up, I was thinking about just a personal experience that I went with an old Aboriginal man one day, and we're in the bush, walking in the bush, and there was this whole idea that everything you see, even the animals or the birds or the particular kinds of birds, that the world kind of speaks. You look out and there's a bird, I don't think you have it in the US, but it's called a willy wagtail here, and they have a long tail.
Don't know it.
They have a long tail, and they wag it like when they come, they kind of wag their tail. They're a bit like a dog, and that's like they like to see you. And I remember him saying that he always thinks they bring good messages. He likes it when he sees a willy wagtail.
Sure. Willy wagtail.
Anyway, when I went for a walk this morning down the beach, and you only see them rarely, and they're not like in groups like the kookaburras here, hang out in a big rowdy mob, and the galahs and the cockatoos and all of that. But the willy wagtails, you just see them every now and again. And as I was walking down the beach, a willy wagtail came on the ramp and just sat itself down there and started wagging its tail. So I guess that's a synchronicity.
Lovely. The attunement with nature, what we can discover in the world. There's a kind of conversation that's going on all the time, and we've lost that. We've educated ourselves out of that with our rational, scientific, reductive perspective. And the question is, how do we move forward? Because I think as wonderful as modern science, especially applied to medicine, has been for many things, we are also in a cul-de-sac. That the world has become more and more dead to us, and as it's become mechanistic, our capacity to be stewards of the earth has really, really diminished. And so I think there's a need for some kind of revitalization. I don't think we can go back to just living the indigenous life.
No.
We have to be who we are, but how do we respectfully understand that worldview and incorporate more of that? Our education gets us so focused. We're very sharply able to discern and analyze things, but we miss what's going on in the margins a lot. To defocus, to take in and hear what else is going on. And that's where I think synchronicity is one of the things that emerged in Jung's own experimentation that began to open up that other world again. I think he actually was on his way towards a re-enchantment, and synchronicity was a key component to that.
Don't you think in one way he, there's a bit of a tradition in Jung's family, like with his mother, and that uncanny side, if we could call it that, or that, sometimes I call it permeability now. It's like he was very open to that kind of understanding. So it was a little there anyway, wasn't it? It's just that maybe science came in as a way of also explaining it.
As a medical student, he got involved with his cousin Helly, who was a bit of a medium. She was a young woman in her teens, maybe about 15, 16. She had quite a crush on him, and was quite gifted as a medium. But over time, she began to be interested in holding his attention, so she began to overplay her abilities, and that caused him to pull back and be suspicious. And he wrote his doctoral, or the equivalent of a doctoral dissertation. It was his medical thesis on the so-called psychopathology of occult phenomena. And his ambivalence about that, but he was clearly really fascinated, and he later developed a friendship with William James, who was, of course, the American psychologist who was very, very interested in exploring and understanding these kinds of phenomena. He had a medium in Boston, a woman named Lenora Piper, that was really extremely gifted. So that was always in the background. But it wasn't until really he was working on the Red Book, and I think I'm beginning to understand how and why he came to synchronicity as almost a necessity to really complete that work.
It's kind of like, I think it was Milan Kundera who's said a couple of things, and one is that it's to deprive oneself from beauty, not to be open to the, well, in my language, the intelligent universe, the synchronistic universe. It deprives us of a lot, doesn't it, really?
Absolutely. That's a nice framing, that Jung was always a little bit cautious about the aesthetic. I think he was so Platonic that he always put truth and beauty into tension, and he had a hard time with the whole notion of art and beauty. But I think you're absolutely right that individuation requires an aesthetic element, and synchronicity points to an elegance in the universe that really is a kind of sense of symmetry between mind and matter in some very fundamental ways. So yes, I think that's absolutely a lovely way to frame that.
And what about you, Joe? How did you, I think I read in the beginning of your book, you were saying that through your clinical practice, you came across.
Yeah. I mean, I had been interested in synchronicity more from a kind of amateur, just curiosity about odd coincidences that had happened to myself or those around me. But as a serious study, it really came from some work with some people who were traumatized. And in the course of working in depth with them, some synchronistic experiences broke out. I mean, and it really caused me to really rethink what was going on here in the therapeutic relationship, because it very quickly pointed out to me that there was a level of connectivity between us that went far beyond anything in the models I had. And I thought, well, I need to really, grapple with this. And I turned to Jung and I looked carefully through his arguments and realized there were some foibles, there were some mistakes he had made. And what was really my good fortune is I was doing this in the early 90s. And the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico had just really taken off, and they were publishing all of these books and articles about complexity theory and about the way complex adaptive systems have the capacity to self-organize and produce emergent phenomena. And as I read that, I began to realize, my goodness, this is a wonderful way of describing what I'm experiencing with this clientele. So that model then became something that served multiple purposes. Not only did it help me understand these clinical cases, but it made a bridge between my background in the sciences and my second career as an analyst, and that has stood the test of time. If anything, I'm watching in the 21st century that the relevance of these ideas is growing. And quite honestly, I can see a trajectory in Jung that would have brought him very much into the line with what I'm talking about with this. I mean, he has this thing in the Red Book where he says the divine child is the product of the marriage of order and chaos. And of course, when you look at complex systems and you look at emergent phenomena where you get a holistic expression for a structure forms that can't be described by the parts, it's at the edge of order and chaos. That's the ideal conditions. So inherent in Jung's metaphors and understanding and his turn towards alchemy was this complexity already built into the model before the language had been articulated in the larger scientific culture. So
you kind of, just going back there for a second, you were a scientist, weren't you? And then you
yes,
became an analyst. And I
yes,
recently read you undertook analysis with, which I didn't know, with James Hillman at some stage as well.
yes, that's great. Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
and then this was a way of actually going back to your science background and kind of bringing them
That's right.
together, you know, Jungian and science.
Absolutely. Yeah, that it was really very crucial. I mean, I didn't know what to do with my science career. I had trained, I'd gotten a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, and I studied in multiple areas in kind of the edge of physics and chemistry, but the main focus was on quantum mechanics applied to small molecular systems. And I say that because what came of those studies was looking at fields, interactive fields at a molecular level and doing the quantum mechanics of it. But it really trained me into thinking in terms of fields of interaction. And as I made the move into psychology, that was something that carried over. The interactive fields of engagement in the therapeutic process was there was enough kinship there that I could really begin to feel kind of an intuitive sensibility for how that might work. That again was part of this exploration, and with the traumatized people, I began to realize that their psyches often were deprived of the ability to put things into language to articulate them, but there were other mechanisms in the field of communication, and that synchronistic experiences seem to be these kind of communications, not from the conscious mind, but from the field itself, the interaction that was being co-created.
So this is what, the layperson like myself in the 80s, we were hearing about the new science. And I remember there was
Yeah,
Fritjof Capra and Margaret
yes,
Wheatley, or Meg Wheatley, as I understand,
yeah,
leadership in the new
yeah,
science. But there was this idea that, I think in Fritjof Capra, that the Tao of
yeah.
physics, that there was the
Physics,
idea
yes,
that that what we had been hearing from the East, perhaps, uh,
yes,
in some way, science was helping us to understand that there was a correlation between
yes,
the new science and the East.
yeah.
And
Go ahead, please.
sorry. Well, I think
Go
just finishing with that, and Meg Wheatley was more on this kind of emergent systems, and as you
Yes,
were talking about it, she was talking about
yeah,
autopoietic, I remember, and strange attractors, things like that.
yes. Yeah, and those fields, there has been some convergence of those fields in the sciences. And the thing that I think is really, they've helped break through a kind of Cartesian framework that for about 400 years held dominance in the West. And what becomes curious is the way in which the breaking through, and we can go back to the Copenhagen solution for quantum mechanics, the wave particle duality and all of that kind of business, that 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 began to challenge the fundamental um, cosmology that we hold, and really said, well, maybe the universe is more complex than the models we're allowing ourselves. And if you penetrate into that and you begin to explore, you get these odd parallels with some of the philosophy that has evolved in the East through meditation. I've been particularly interested in an aspect of Chinese Buddhism. It's a kind of marriage of incorporation of Buddhism from India and native Taoism in China. And the school really flourished during the Tang Dynasty around the 8th century. It was called Huayan, the Flower Garland School. And they evolved a model of the universe through their exploration of nothingness that has some remarkable similarities to the best astrophysics of today. And you have to ask yourself, well, perhaps these are alternative routes to the exploration of the nature of reality. We've used a kind of Western scientific, mathematical, algorithmic approach to try to understand the nature of reality, and we've gotten so far. And as that reaches its kind of culmination, and we have to push beyond, we find ourselves in a vision of the universe that looks curiously like these very deep Eastern meditation schools have been talking about. And exactly what that means, I don't yet truly understand, except those are pretty powerful coincidences. And I think it says something more about the nature of reality, quite honestly. This is something that was actually in Jung's synchronicity hypothesis, because when you read through his text, he makes this rather shocking remark that in synchronistic phenomena, not only are they an act of creation in time, he said, but in a way, it's as if space and time um, go to almost zero, and the laws of physics no longer hold, and that's why it doesn't fit into our cause and effect. Well, that model is, of course, a model of the Big Bang. And this was being articulated in the late 1940s at the very moment that's being articulated in physics. Now, whether Pauli fed him that or not, I would suspect he did. But the brilliance of it is to take synchronicity and say, as it's a pattern forming tendency, and it's there at the very origins of our universe, that it's part of the fundamental nature of reality. Well, that's an extraordinary thing. That isn't just you and me having a personal coincidence, you know, but they give us a window, a portal back to something of that originary moment. And that to me puts us in a different fundamental relationship with the universe.
Well, it sounds a little bit like a cosmos. You know, the difference between
Yes.
the absurdity or the meaninglessness of things, and then this kind of
Yeah.
implicate order and the hidden order and
Yes.
the cosmos and a meaningful.
Yes, right. And I think that's, what the best of contemporary scientists recognize that loss of meaning has left us in this disenchanted place that can't carry the fullness of our experience. That there's something about the spiritual that's absolutely part of the human psyche, and because we can't fit it into an algorithm doesn't mean that it isn't real and it doesn't exist. And so I've been watching more and more sort of people at the level of Nobel scientists who are starting to try to talk about the way we need to think about incorporating spirit back into the world. I think this is really where the 21st century is, where it's going to be a century of complexity, and part of that complexity is to have pathways that allow that possibility for us.
So a worldview which includes the spirit, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. What exactly that means and what it looks like, I don't know. I mean, to go back for just a moment to the entheogens and the use of psychedelics, the way they're used in indigenous cultures. In more recently, I found myself reading anthropologists and their descriptions of those worlds, and it's become increasingly clear to me that those cultures are what we call immanentist cultures. That is, the spiritual is part of the world. It's not in another realm. It isn't a transcendent world like that. And so going forward, our relation to spirituality is going to have to work through that difference. I don't think you can just use, for example, those substances as plant medicine, as you were, with our cosmology, and try to use them as if we were in that world. There is something else that has to happen for us to develop a kind of an awareness of what may be present here and now, not there and then.
And I think, whenever you get onto spirituality, you always have that problem because people have such an association with religion, with the God figure, don't they? Or
Absolutely.
transcendental, and that puts a lot of people off. But I find, anyway, when you talk to people about what is it, an engagement with the natural world, that's a different thing. People can very much respond. Many people can respond to that. And that's what I see in the Indigenous culture a little more, maybe that immanence, what you were talking about, but it's a full engagement, or full-on more engagement with the natural world.
Yeah, I think that's what we've partly lost, and that's what's necessary. More and more, that's for me where spiritual experience resides more profoundly, is in really opening up at deeper levels, deeper levels of the unconscious. I mean, I've gotten interested in things like, forest systems with these mycorrhizal networks, the underground connectedness that the fungi connect the trees up into these superorganisms that are, that kind of thing, because it gives a picture of an intelligence below the surface in nature and how interconnected things are. And I've begun to think that there may be ways in which we can enter into greater dialogue with that. And I say that from my experiences starting in doing analysis, because how do we engage with the unconscious of the other? Oftentimes that's not on the surface, it's not self-evident, but there are things like learning a disciplined approach to using one's reverie, to watching what happens with one's inner responses, the imagery, the thoughts, the feelings that spontaneously emerge as we're talking with another person, that often touches, when we pay attention to that, often touches into what isn't being said, really brings forward that which is in the background. And might those same kinds of thoughts and ways of approaching things be a way of being in nature? I think so. I think there's a way of listening to nature. It's not going to speak in a cognitive manner or like a human, but I think there are other ways in which these fields of interaction can create reverie and imagery in us that has a kind of veracity. I mean, I was really, when I was president of Pacifica, we suffered a series of environmental problems and catastrophes. We had this huge fire at the end of 2017, came very close to both campuses, and then a month or so later, these heavy rains came, and there was this enormous debris flow and flooding, and destroyed a lot of land, cut off our main highway for 3-4 weeks. It was amazing. And both campuses were relatively untouched. And I kept pondering why that was so. And then there's a group of indigenous people here called the Chumash who live in the Santa Barbara area. And some of their elders have been involved with Pacifica. And I talked with them and I said, what about these lands? And they said, well, do you know that originally these were seen by us as sacred lands? And so the more I talked with them, the more I began to realize there was a deep ecological vision, that where the school was placed was in respect to the ecology, in a very safe place. That was part of its sacredness. And one can still feel that on the campuses, and you walk, they have a rather special quality, but the sense of there was a kind of indigenous wisdom that could read the landscape and really see where the forces were, where the dangers were, and to really honor those places that that had a special kind of relationship to the environment. That brought it home in a very real way and gave it a very powerful spiritual quality for me, not in a transcendent way, but in an immediately lived way.
And it seems to be that is just speaking to a lot of people, that the sky god father or whatever is just a little out of we don't know whether that's going to be resuscitated anytime soon, and maybe not. But the thing of reading, as you were saying, reading the geography and listening and being receptive and being open, things like that is kind of, it's more earth. There's more earth in it, isn't there?
Yeah, I think that we could begin a set of questions. What does the world need and want from us? I mean, to actually just go in nature and try that. I've been thinking a lot about this and doing workshops on wonder and awe, rekindling the sense of the capacity for wonder. We have it as children, most of us, unless we've been traumatized, but we're often educated out of it, or it's very sharply focused on particular things that our educational system wants us to wonder about. But we've lost that sense of the capacity to be in the world with that, and rekindling that begins to give the start of an animating of the world. And then I think from there's a kind of dialoguing that's possible. I mean, there's also the question of awe, of feeling the sense of the otherness and the largeness of the natural world. And that sense of awe begins to open doors towards spirituality. And I think then, is there conversation with the spirit of the place, the genius loci or genius loci, that this is an art that we've lost, but maybe it's not forever gone. Can we rekindle it?
And when people say, when you talk to people and they might think that's a regression into the deep, distant past, what do you say?
Well, yeah, I would say if I were wanting to just simply throw away the scientific world and discovery, yeah, that would be a problem. I'm not personally there. I know some people want to, and I can understand the longing to have a low-tech life, but I don't think that's our future. And so for me, it's how do I find those kinds of experiences along and beside and extend my scientific knowledge. So let me give you one example where that started to come up for me, and it's around COVID. I had a couple of interesting experiences with COVID, and I began to really look at this question of origins. And it turns out at Harvard, there's a Chan Center that does research on these kind of topics, and they have a theory. And I believe it's probably the most cogent theory for this. They're saying that COVID is really fundamentally a response to global warming. And the argument is that as you heat the planet up, the tropics in particular become unbearable. In our state of Arizona this summer, I had some friends there. It's not even the tropics, but the stones in their yard, which were higher than the rest of the atmosphere, but those stones were staying at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, that's unsustainable. You can't live there. You die if you're in sustained contact with that. So you can see that just for survival reasons, the animal species began to migrate to latitudes that were a little cooler. Well, in the process of doing that, it brings them into contact with migrating species, birds, bats, and so forth. And that's, of course, exactly the opportunistic conditions for viral transfer, because these species, if they've never been in contact with one another, whatever viruses they're carrying, have a free shot at the other species doesn't have any immune responses yet developed, and so you get this kind of hopping that goes on. And the next thing we know, as these animals get brought to market, we've got a pandemic on our hands. And the idea is not that the planet is seeking revenge, but more the notion that we're fundamentally engineering and creating the conditions to do this. And if we don't like that, we had better think about how we're behaving unless we want to drive this further in that direction. And so there's a kind of listening to the world and a listening to things like COVID as a teacher. And that's led to a variety of things for me. I mean, um, in terms of how COVID in the lockdown, as difficult and painful as that was, there was a return of nature. I was sitting in my office at Pacifica, only three of us on campus for an extended period of time. And one day, about 2 months into the lockdown, I look out in the middle of the afternoon. There's a family of deer walking up the driveway. I'd never seen anything like that. I mean, usually they're much more cautious, but with the quieting of the world, something else began to return, and it wasn't just me. I was running a group in China, and we talked a bit about this, and in the middle of that, someone had a very powerful emotional reaction, and we slowed it down and said, well, what happened? She said, I had this huge wave of nostalgia, and I couldn't figure out what happened, why. It just came out of nowhere. And as we talked about it, she said, now I realize I was looking at the sky, and it was a color blue that I hadn't seen for more than 10 years. That, it was about, with the calming down, the pollution had dropped, and the experience of being in the world, and it was palpable in the room with all of us that just how powerful this experience was. So
It's
it
like
does seem to,
the
yeah,
supports were taken away, weren't they? And the external stimuli and but within that, going back maybe to something essential, that maybe quite a few people had that kind of experience.
Well, as I've talked to people sort of in this recovery phase, I hear more and more of these stories, that how difficult it was on the one hand, and yet the kinds of things people discovered in that period. And the question is how not to just simply lose that, not just to say, oh, that was nice, but let's get on with things.
And from my point of view, you might agree or disagree, but I think sometimes we're a bit addicted to, I feel, the political solution, political action, although I know it's very
Yeah.
important.
Yes,
But
yes, yeah.
but it's somehow, to go back to this primary relationship, the anima mundi,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
soul of the world, that in a sense that is what brings beauty in a different way. And so we can talk about how we have to stop climate change or whatever, but it's through that kind of what is it, regeneration of soul in the world, that somehow that's becoming more of a real thing within us.
Yes, I absolutely think, yeah, political action, yes, of course. We want activism, we want to try to stop these things. But we've been doing that for 70 years now, and uh, a lot of these problems are still there. I think it's about a change in consciousness. And it's not going, I don't think we can start with the politicians and expect that they're going to be the ones. They're going to be driven by something that's probably more bottom up, that if there's greater awareness and greater demand that these things be treated with reverence, that will be listened to when there's enough voices that can see the importance and value of that.
You believe in the kind of 100th monkey idea from a long time ago in the sense?
Yeah, sure. Rupert Sheldrake's idea. Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, I think there's something there, that there is a kind of kindling that happens to certain kinds of ideas. You can see that with scientific discovery. It happens over and over again. Everybody's banging their head on a problem and nobody can solve it. And suddenly somebody solves it. And then bing, 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 five other labs in the world come up with, corroborating evidence in a very short period of time. There is something in the field in that sense. And
Maybe
yeah,
that
how
goes
many
back a
people
bit to what you were saying about chaos
know
uh,
order
and order.
that edge?
That, yeah. that
getting on that edge.
there is actually something happening in the chaos. We can
Yes.
say.
Yeah.
Well, we hope.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't want to lose our capacity for chaos and for unconscious process. Otherwise, there's no regeneration.
So, Joe, what else are you thinking about synchronicity? Because you wrote that book, and you know you've spoken about it for some time. Is there another area which is kind of intriguing you and engaging you at the moment?
Well, there's several spin-offs. I mean, this re-enchantment piece is one I'm very much interested in working. Along with that, I've gotten interested in what I'm calling, for lack of a better term, the psychoid imagination. You know, when Jung proposed the synchronicity hypothesis, he began to realize he had to go beyond just human psychology, that because there were aspects of the way objects in the world were responding, there had to be something where the physical and the psychological interdigitated, that they really interacted in some fundamental way. And he began to talk about sort of the archetypal patterns having aspects that go off into the spirit at the top end and into matter at the lower end. And he described that as being inaccessible to consciousness. But I've begun to think more and more, and have been tracking artists throughout history who have developed great insight into nature that they've represented in their artwork that's well beyond anything in the culture to describe that. And so it's another one of these places, like we were talking earlier about the Buddhism and the meditation and the science coming to similar conclusions. Well, you can find a series of artists who have created things that really are well beyond anything that's understood at the time. I give one simple example: that Van Gogh, his some of his paintings, like the Starry Night, very, very famous, obviously.
Yeah.
You can't find it in reproductions, but if you stand in front of the original, the light twinkles. And a group of physicists went and looked at it, and were really fairly stunned. And they've written this up, and it's now kind of all over the internet, that what he painted captures the phenomena of turbulence in a way it's really spectacular, because he's capturing something that they understand qualitatively but cannot quantitatively describe, the effect that he's been able to paint into the canvas. And the question is how and why that was possible. But I think it's probably there in more ways than most of us know. We just don't have enough knowledge to recognize when this has happened. I looked at some paintings that Jung did around the time of his Red Book experience that didn't make it in. And it turns out that he had a case of Spanish flu in 1919. And he got very interested as he was recovering. He almost died. And he went through a recovery process, and he had a series of fever dreams that he painted. And they ended up revolving around this sphere that was floating between these trees on this island. Won't go through all of it, except that it made it into the Red Book finally as a kind of set of trees where this kind of glowing in the dark sphere was there. And I had recognized it kind of as an alchemical lumen naturae, the light of nature, the consciousness deep in nature. But then when I found out that he had Spanish flu, and I looked at the electron microscope studies of Spanish flu, it's like COVID. It's a very similar shape. It's a sphere with all these spike proteins, and there's some remarkably similar features to some of what he was painting. And he tried to borrow from some biological systems that he knew about in terms of this image. The imagery of the virus was far in the future. There was no way anyone at that point could have known it. But did the unconscious intuition pick this up and represent it? And why I particularly am interested in this, you'll see where it links together, is he makes a statement in 1932, after he's had a synchronistic experience with receiving this book of Chinese alchemy from his friend in China and asking him to commentary, it's the Secret of the Golden Flower. In that book, he has a line, "The gods have become diseases." And for me, that is a very quintessential comment on disenchantment. What had been divine has now become our pathologies. And his example would be that the worship of Aphrodite is turned into pornography. That we don't have, we've lost the sacred sense of these things, and we treat them in a kind of dismissive and pathological way. Well, might that painting represent a kind of unconscious reversal? He's taken the pathology, the disease entity, and he's turned it into a light in nature. That is something, a consciousness that's pointing the way towards a new kind of understanding. And it would be to say that the disease has become the new pathway to the gods, a kind of re-enchantment. I think actually there's something in there, and he needed the synchronistic piece to close that loop. So what I'm suggesting is that if we live in a world where the gods have deteriorated into our pathogenic psychological conditions, then recovery is by looking at our illnesses and seeing them for their potential to open up the spirit to us again.
And what I get from that, what I find important about that is perhaps, the way Thomas More speaks is that sometimes in therapy, people come to him as a therapist, they want the therapist to eradicate something, fix something up, or get things straight, get the relationship in order.
Yeah.
And, but it's almost like the end point in, well, maybe the wrong languaging, but it's like, it's the opening up. It's the mystery. It's the the other in a wider, larger sense, which is the same as what you were saying in different language.
Yeah, I think that's a very key point, that therapy is not about providing a bunch of answers to solve problems. Our computer algorithmic culture does that. And it does it well. But therapy, if it produces psychological change for people, it's really about deepening their relationship to their own questions, to seeing that they really open up into much larger, richer stories, the narratives that they lead to, rather than solutions, they lead to more interesting questions. And
further into the mystery, let's say.
Yeah. I think that it's been my experience working with people that there's been generally, over the course of the work we do, an increase in curiosity about themselves, about the world, that it's being able to step back and go, what just happened there? And that allowing that play to unfold reveals, you have to slow down, basically. Otherwise, you go right past a lot of phenomena. You don't get the symbolism. You don't get the deeper meaning. It just seems like a surface event, and oh well. But to get to that deeper experience, how do you, sort of bring yourself into a state of mind that's resonant with it? And I think slowing down is absolutely key. That's often what therapy involves for people at the beginning is, well, what about this? How about that? Which feels sometimes like a distraction to people.
Well, it was a lot of work. I remember when I started Jungian therapy, and it was like, it was like spending 4 hours a day writing down a dream and wondering what that could possibly mean. I thought, man, this takes a lot of work, this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It's not a straightforward pathway. It really is circumambulatory, so to speak.
Well, I think, we're getting to the end, Joe, but can I ask you a personal question, even though we have been talking about opening to the wider mystery, but, they are related. What is perhaps the one piece of synchronicity in your life that maybe just comes to mind as something that really has had an influence on?
Well, there are several kind of key events in my life. I'm not quite sure whether, there's synchronistic elements to it. Um, Probably the most pivotal moment for me in my life was my decision after I had postdoced for a couple of years at Stanford. I decided to take a position as a visiting scholar professor at Osaka University. And I went to Japan, really in part to give myself a pause to figure out where I really wanted to go next. Because I was not terribly happy with just pursuing an academic career in chemistry at the time, the way it was. And that led me to discover a Zen group in Kyoto, which was a 45-minute train ride away. And so I began to go on a weekly basis. And that it was very psychoactive and produced a tremendous amount of internal material, which the Zen people said, "Oh, yes, don't worry, it'll go away." I said, "Well, yeah, I can see that as an end goal, but I think I want to process this more before I let go of it." And it's like I'm not just clinging to it, but there's meaning here, and I want to get to it. And they just didn't have an interest in that. And that's when I discovered Jung in a serious way. I mean, I'd known about him, and then there were some experiences around that, dreams that happened that really pointed to a whole transformational journey that I needed to take. And that really started. So it was this coincidence of getting out of one's own culture, being in a place where, in effect, I was illiterate. At first I couldn't read any of the characters,
A
very
little
few
bit
of
like
them.
what you were saying earlier about COVID, when we lost all of the familiar.
That's
But
right.
going to another country is a somewhat similar kind of,
Yeah.
and especially the East.
Yeah. And then immersing in a system, a meditative system that was unlike anything that I'd previously experienced in my life. And, the kind of opening that spontaneously produced, that that moved me. And then the clinical synchronicities come next. The switch in fields, and then as I'm really beginning to learn this, then suddenly having these experiences with patients that were, where we were finding things that were happening to one another that um, couldn't be explained in any kind of rational kind of way. Precognitive dreams and experiences of things coming together that just had on the surface no way that those things could have just fallen by accident together. So
That's nice. And can you just tell us, just lastly, after all those years of undertaking analysis with James Hillman, considering I've just read the third volume of The Life and Ideas of
I
James
haven't
Hillman,
got it yet. Yes, I'm just getting it. I'm waiting for it.
which I have taken a lot from immensely. What is one thing you can just share with us as we depart about your time with James Hillman, and perhaps
Oh.
something you might
Yeah,
think
well,
of?
that was yeah. Well, he was a remarkable analyst in many ways. It was often an uncanny experience being with him. Um, his intuition was remarkable, and his scholarly knowledge. I mean, he was incredibly well read. But we would start I can't tell you, this happened hundreds of times, not just once or twice. We'd start with a little chit chat about what's going on, just sort of settling in. And in under 5 minutes, in the chit chat, he'd just make an observation or comment on something. And I would say, well, that's funny. I had a dream that touched on exactly that topic. And there we were, off into the depths. And that sense of, out of just what's floating on the surface, there were these tendrils that led down into the deepest areas of unconscious life. And I can remember very early on, one of the real moments of awakening is we had some ongoing conversations around a series of dreams that were emerging in the analysis. And I began to realize that there was a conversation going on between figures in the unconscious and the analyst. And I was sort of in between. And it made me realize that the analyst's empathy, Jim's empathy, was for the figures in the background, not for the ego. And it had a really powerful effect of troping, of really turning me around and saying, oh, what are you paying attention to? And it's speaking back. And being in the midst of that, I think what really opened up my experience of the depths in a way that was a very real and felt experience. And I don't know that I could have done it so easily without somebody with that kind of gift. So I'm forever grateful for that, quite honestly.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and thanks for talking to us. And
It's been great
I've
to talk with
enjoyed
you, John. Yeah,
Thanks.
I've enjoyed getting to know you. Yeah, thanks, John. Okay. Take care.